It was late, and the only sound in the kitchen was the soft hum of the refrigerator. I had just finished cleaning the countertops and stacking the dishes. Making sure everything was in order, the routine and the regularity of it all were comforting, but nothing seemed predictable that night. As I reached to turn off the light, I felt a slight shift in the atmosphere behind me, as if someone was present. I turned abruptly, expecting to see nothing but empty space. I was startled to see a stranger standing in the doorway. His face was inscrutable, but his intense gaze chilled me. I had never seen him before and didn't know him, yet there he was, still, silent, and unquestionably genuine. Wasn't trying to frighten you. His beautiful voice had an unexpected warmth that caused me to pause as he spoke. Despite his easygoing demeanor, there was something strikingly inappropriate about his presence. I had a nagging suspicion that he knew. I didn't do it. I tried to seem casual as I said, "Oh, no worries. I didn't hear you enter, but I could feel my heart pounding." I believed I was all by myself. As though sensing my unease, he grinned and stood there without saying anything. He seemed to be testing me or waiting for something while he watched. Perhaps I struggled to find anything to say, a means of breaking the rapidly growing ice between us. "You want something to eat, don't you?" It was strange to say, but the words somehow escaped my lips before I could process them. He shrugged, a tiny smile teasing the corner of his mouth. "Sure, why not?" I suggested, clumsily pointing to the partially cleaned counter. I looked at the refrigerator again, removing a few items as I could sense his gaze lingering on me. That look returned, an odd familiarity mingling with something else I couldn't quite pinpoint, but I remained unfazed. I occupied myself in the hopes that the straightforward task of cooking would restore the rhythm I had lost when he first showed up and I started cutting. I was compelled to inquire, "What has brought you here?" After a brief pause, as though considering his response, he remarked, "I got a little lost on the way." Even though his statements seemed light, there seemed to be more to them than that, based on his tone. From there, our conversation flowed naturally, but there was an underlying mystery that he kept hidden from me. His eyes and the small pauses between his sentences gave the impression that he was waiting for me to understand something that I didn't fully understand, which made me uneasy in a way I hadn't anticipated. The kitchen, which had once been a place of simple routine, now felt charged, with every movement intensifying as we spoke. His slight lean was one of the minor details I observed. Too close, with his arm's warmth on mine as he reached for a spoon, I could feel the tension between us growing almost physically. There was something irresistible, something magnetic, drawing us in. Despite the fact that we both kept things lighthearted, I could feel the beginnings of something strange slipping into the atmosphere as our filled the room. It was in how his eyes lingered a moment. Longer, the subtle undertone in his voice, as if we both knew what was happening between us, but were too careful to call it that. The sensation was both nerve-wracking and exhilarating, akin to being on the verge of danger. He grabbed the knife from me, his fingers brushing mine, and said, "Are you brave enough to come forward?" He said, "Let me do that here." His voice was low, and while it was such a basic gesture, I was surprised by the closeness it contained. I hadn't realized how close we'd gotten until then, the two of us standing there side by side in the dim light of the kitchen. He began chopping, and I watched him, unable to resist the quiet intensity he brought to something as ordinary as slicing vegetables, the rhythm of his movements, the quiet confidence he exuded. It was mesmerizing, and I felt myself getting drawn in. Forgetting the strangeness of his sudden presence, somehow in that small act he'd managed to shift the balance, taking control in a way that left me both intrigued and a little unsteady. We fell into a companionable silence, punctuated only by the soft chop of the knife against the cutting board. I leaned against the counter watching him, feeling a strange pull that was both exciting and unnerving, and yet I didn't want to break the spell, didn't want to disrupt whatever fragile connection had formed between us. But then, just as I thought I'd gotten a handle on it, he glanced up, catching my gaze in a way that made my heart skip. He kept it there, his face inscrutable, and then he smiled a little, sending a chill down my back. "There's something special about this location." Almost to himself, he said, "It feels familiar." His words were heavy in the air. I was unable to pinpoint the feeling he was expressing, but there was something about the way he said it that gave me the impression that we were sharing a secret. I was curious to know what he meant. To move a little bit further, but his intense stare imprisoned me, and it appeared as though the kitchen walls had suddenly closed in, leaving the two of us on the verge of something I couldn't quite understand, but couldn't deny that I wanted to discover: music. The days that followed that evening in the kitchen formed a pattern that I struggled to articulate. It wasn't as if we had planned to reunite, yet he unexpectedly showed up, seemingly able to read my thoughts and anticipate the right moment. Even though I tried to brush it aside, I couldn't help but notice the odd eagerness that was growing inside of me before I had them. I would find myself anticipating his voice and the sound of the kitchen chair as he sat down. I knew I was caught, even though neither of us dared to admit it, because his eyes were meeting mine across the room with that calm, knowing look that always made me tense. It was unnerving in a manner that both excited and scared me. The tension between us increased, and, even when he wasn't around, I could feel his presence. It clung to me like a secret I didn't know how to share, and perhaps that was part of the allure, the secrecy, and the excitement of something unsaid lingering in the air. One evening, he reappeared just as I was about to close up, and the sight of him leaning casually in the doorway, his face lit only by the dim kitchen light, made my heart race. He had a way of making even the smallest gestures feel charged, as if there were layers to everything he did, secrets I wasn't supposed to reveal, but I felt compelled to. I felt the air between us shift, thickening with a tension that was almost palpable. It was as if we were locked in some invisible dance, each move carefully calculated, neither of us willing to break the fragile balance that had somehow formed. Without saying a word, he stepped into the kitchen, moving closer, his expression unreadable. I looked up, meeting his gaze, and felt an odd flutter in my stomach. It was just the two of us for a minute as all else vanished, and his eyes held mine in a calm passion that was seething beneath the surface. "You simply keep turning up here," I remarked, making a grin to lighten the atmosphere. Even though my heart was thumping in my chest, he didn't respond. I was standing there in the tiny kitchen, the silence thick with words left unsaid. He immediately cocked his head slightly, his gaze never leaving mine. "Perhaps," he said, "I have a reason." His voice, heavy and deep, sent my heart racing. Something about the way he talked stood out, a surety that dispelled all possibility of doubt, and I found myself leaning in, attracted to him in a manner that defied reason. I gulped, trying to think of anything to say. However, it seemed like the words were stuck in my throat. I was aware that he could detect my body's reaction to his every motion, but I didn't want to recognize the impact he had on me. He could see it in the way I looked at him a bit too long, the way my breath caught whenever he was close, and even though I tried to deny it, I knew I was falling, caught in a current from which I had no way out. But before I could say anything, he moved closer, bringing us closer. His hand touched mine, a quick, fleeting touch, but it sent a chill down my spine, igniting a fire that had been simmering just beneath the surface. I felt myself leaning into him, pulled by an inexplicable urge that was both thrilling and terrible. "You keep returning, but why?" "Maybe I'm waiting for you to let me in," he whispered, my voice barely audible, as if speaking too loudly would break the fragile connection between us. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and for a moment I thought he might pull away, but instead he leaned in, his breath warm against my skin. His words were filled with a promise that left me gasping for air. The weight of his gaze and the quiet intensity of his voice were both too much and not enough. Even if it meant venturing into the unknown, I needed and craved more. The tension between us had been growing, and the air became heavy with unspoken yearning. The magic was broken when, after days, weeks, and now at last, it felt like it may break. I was about to close the gap to let myself fall when a sharp noise shattered the quiet like glass, causing us to both freeze and meet our eyes in a shared expression of astonishment. He retreated a step, and the tension between us changed, giving way to an unexplained tension that made me feel vulnerable. I could see it in his eyes, how his gaze darkened and his jaw tightened as he tried to regain his composure, and then all of a sudden, the warmth between us cooled, giving way to a chill that made me shudder. I couldn't figure out why he seemed so far away, as though he were withholding something even though he was directly in front of me. What is the issue? My question, barely audible, elicited no response from him. His face remained enigmatic as he gazed at me, and for a brief moment, I felt a surge of fear. He seemed to be seeing something that I couldn't see, a shadow that only he could comprehend. The room felt colder, the once-war atmosphere now tinged with something darker, a tension that had nothing to do with the desire simmering between us, and he seemed to be caught in a battle. I failed to recognize a conflict going on inside of him that had somehow escaped into our small, peaceful world. In an attempt to close the distance between us and bring him back from whatever edge he was standing on, I stretched out, but he pulled back, his mouth clenching as if he were keep my question, barely audible, elicited no response from him, talking more to himself than to me. It was then that I understood there were layers he was him that I had never before recognized. His motions tight, he turned to go, years I hadn't yet started to comprehend. I had deep-seated anguish and a sense of loss, as if he were being drawn by an unseen force, but as he approached the doorway, he stopped, his palm resting on the frame. And I briefly believed that he may turn around, remain, and eventually allow me inside, but he didn't. Without a word, he vanished into the darkness, leaving me alone in the deserted kitchen, the stillness weighing me down like an insurmountable burden. As I stood there, the memories of our time together clinging to me, I knew that whatever was going on between us was still very much alive. The story had just begun, and I firmly believed that I had sunk too far to return. I was trapped in a web of emotions that I didn't understand, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that he would return, that he would always be waiting just out of reach. As I leaned against the counter and stared into the empty space where he had stood, I silently promised myself that I would do whatever it took to understand him and discover the mystery that was hidden in those dark, unreadable eyes. But I knew it wouldn't be simple. I half expected to see him there, leaning against the counter, watching me with that quiet intensity that had become both a comfort and a thrill, but even after days had passed since that charged evening in the kitchen, I couldn't get rid of the memory of him, the intensity of his gaze, and the mystery that lingered between us every time I entered the kitchen. One night, he was there. Turning around, I found him standing a few feet away, his expression as unreadable as ever. My heart skipped a beat, the room's air thickening as our eyes locked, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if time had stopped and the outside world had vanished. I hadn't even heard him enter. You weren't returning, I thought. There was something different about him tonight. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, the quiet energy that had always drawn me in, and as he closed the distance between us, I felt myself giving into the pull, the inevitable nature of it all. His hand reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face, and the gentleness of the gesture caught me off guard. He heard the words, barely a breath, but his gaze softened, a glimmer of something unsaid flickering in his eyes as he took a step closer. He touched me with a vulnerability I had never seen before. I looked up, gasping as his eyes met mine, and for a while we stood there in silence, trapped in a moment that seemed both strong and vulnerable. It was as if he were lowering his guard and allowing me to see behind the barriers he had put up around himself. Whatever was going on between us was real to me at that very instant, because I could feel the warmth of his palm lingering against my cheek and the delicate brush of his fingers across my flesh. He leaned in without saying a word, his lips brushing mine in a gentle, almost tentative kiss, as if he were trying to see if I would back off, but I didn't. I leaned into him, my arms encircling his shoulders. Feeling the tension release as we melted into one another, the world fading away, and all I could feel was him, the warmth of his body against mine, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my hands. He held me as if I were something valuable, something to be treasured, and there was something kind, even respectful, about that. I hadn't anticipated this sensation, yet it felt so natural and perfect. His hands found mine, entwining our fingers as he drew me in. Deep in the kiss, and I had a closeness that was indescribable. Beyond reason, it seemed as though we had discovered something in one another that neither of us had realized we were looking for. We moved in unison, our bodies swaying in a rhythm that felt both familiar and new, as if we were two pieces of a whole finally coming together. His hands brushed along my arms, firm but gentle, grounding me in the moment as we sank deeper into each other. I could feel the tension in his shoulders, the quiet strength in his movements, and the vulnerability in his eyes as I looked up. I was in awe of that. We didn't need to talk, so we kept quiet. The warmth of his hands gripping mine, the soft brush of our lips, and the quiet contained all we felt and wanted to convey. It was an indescribable tie that seemed to have been forever, just waiting for us to discover it. As we held each other, engrossed in the moment, I could feel the warmth emanating from him and the soft hum of his breath against my skin. We stood there in one another's arms, and I knew that I had discovered something unique that I didn't want to part with. There was a tenderness in the air, something sacred in the quiet. We continued to swing in such a manner. He gently caressed my cheek, a delicate touch that sent a shiver down my spine. As he drew me nearer, a warmth enveloped me, instilling in me a sense of belonging I hadn't realized I was lacking. So, in the dim light of the kitchen, our breaths mingled in the quiet, and the world outside faded into a distant memory. It was just us caught in a moment that felt both infinite and fleeting. We exchanged soft kisses, each one lasting a bit longer and conveying a promise that was beyond words. It was an inexplicable sensation, a serene assurance that I was just where I was supposed to be there. It felt like we were talking, a language that only we could understand, a silent conversation that filled the air with a warmth that encircled us and bound us together in a way that felt both fragile and unbreakable. A quiet room with only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the soft rhythm of our breaths mingling in the silence, and as we held each other in the moment, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a quiet joy that filled the voids in my heart. It was unnecessary to use words. The gentle touch of his hand and the warmth of his embrace contained everything we felt and wanted to say. There was no need to fill the void with explanations or promises. It was a connection that defied logic, a bond that seemed to have been there the entire time we stood there in each other's arms, the outside world vanishing into a faraway memory, and for the first time in a long time I felt whole. It was a feeling I hadn't anticipated, a quiet assurance that I had discovered something genuine, something I didn't want to let go of as the night went by. We remained there, breathing in unison, our hearts beating in time, and when I looked up, I saw the same feeling reflected in his eyes, a warmth that gave me a sense of calm and a quiet joy that I knew I would carry with me long after the night was over. In that instant, I knew that no matter what happened next or what obstacles lay ahead, we would face them together. It was an unspoken pledge, a commitment. I felt optimism blossom as we embraced each other, encased in the warmth of the kitchen, and that didn't require words. There was a serene conviction in me that we had discovered something worthwhile. The night stretched out in front of us like a promise, and the world outside seemed peaceful. I knew I had discovered something unique, something I would treasure forever as we remained there, lost in one another. It was an emotion that transcended words, a bond that filled the voids in my heart, and as I held him close, I felt a calm happiness descend upon me, a tranquility I had not realized I was lacking. We remained in that position, encircled by one another, our hearts pounding in time, and as the minutes passed, I was confident that we would face whatever was coming up together. It was a bond that went beyond words, a connection that filled the air with a warmth that wrapped around us, binding us together in a way that felt both fragile and unbreakable, and as the first light of dawn crept into the kitchen, casting a soft glow over us, I knew that I had found something worth holding on to, a love that went beyond logic, beyond explanation. It was a quiet certainty, a feeling that filled me with a sense of peace, a joy that I knew would stay with me long after the night had ended. After that night, it felt as though the world had shifted in subtle ways, like everything was familiar, but somehow changed. I found myself moving through my days with a sense of calm I hadn't known before, a quiet contentment that lingered long after he'd left. And yet beneath it all there was a restlessness too, a feeling that I was waiting for something, though I couldn't name what. He didn't come by every day. His appearances were irregular, often at the moments when I'd least expect it, yet each time he brought with him that same energy, That same unspoken intensity that filled the room as soon as he entered it was as though he were woven into the fabric of my life, now appearing like a shadow, a presence that felt both familiar and mysterious. I was alone in the kitchen one evening, thinking back on what had happened between us, the quiet intimacy we'd shared, and the way he looked at me as if I were the only person in the world. Just as I was about to nod off, I sensed a familiar change in the air, the almost imperceptible sense that he was close by. I turned, and there he was, standing at the doorway, his expression softer than I'd ever seen it. Tonight, there was something different about him, a gentleness in his eyes, as if he were letting me see a side of himself that he usually kept hidden. Without saying a word, he approached, bringing us closer in a way that seemed both natural and remarkable. When Thorne's palm touched my arm, I felt a wave of warmth wash over me, bringing with it a silent delight that left me gasping for air. "You're here," I said, before I could stop myself. With a gentle, almost nostalgic grin, he said. "As always," he answered. His voice was low, as if he were admitting something that only the two of us could comprehend. In that instant, it seemed as if we were the only two people in the universe bonded, and the outer world didn't exist. Together by something invisible, something unbreakable, we moved through the kitchen together, a silent rhythm that had become second nature, and as we shared small moments, I realized just how much he'd become a part of my life. It was the little things, like the way he'd catch my hand as we passed by each other, the quiet smiles we'd share, the unspoken understanding that lingered between us. It was a bond that went beyond words, a connection that filled the air with a warmth I hadn't known was possible. But tonight there was something different, something heavier, as though he were holding back, as though there was something he wanted to say but couldn't. I felt it in the way he moved, the way his gaze lingered on me a little longer. A quiet tension that simmered just beneath the surface. I reached out my fingers, grazing his arm, and he looked at me, his eyes filled with a depth I couldn't quite understand. There was a vulnerability there, a softness that took my breath away, and for a moment it felt as though we were on the edge of something we couldn't take back. "Is everything okay?" As I requested, my voice barely audible above a whisper, he took my hand and led me to the tiny table near the window, where we were bathed in a warm warmth from the streetlights. I felt my heart skip a beat as he gazed at me, his countenance contemplative, as if he were struggling to find the proper words. There was a calm tension growing in the silence between us, as if he were going to reveal a side of himself, a piece of his past that had been forgotten. "You ought to know something." I could feel the weight of his words, the silent gravity that pervaded the air, as he started out in a low, almost hesitant voice. As he drew a big breath and met my stare with such intensity that I was left speechless, I waited with my heart thumping in my chest. As he started talking, I could see the memories flashing in his eyes, a glimpse of a world he had kept hidden even from himself, a life I had never known. He spoke steadily and in low tones. He told me bits and parts of his life, a narrative that had molded him in ways I never would have thought possible, yet with an emotion I had never heard before. It was a tale of tenacity, hardships, and victories, of losses that had left wounds more profound than I could perceive, and as he talked, I sensed a link developing between us that went beyond our private times. Beyond the warmth and laughter that had permeated our days, we had a friendship that was built on vulnerability and the quiet power that comes from opening up to someone and trusting them enough to show the unvarnished and genuine sides of oneself. I put my hand over his, and he looked at me with a silent appreciation that made me feel both grounded and weightless. We sat like that, the two of us ensnared in a moment that felt both fleeting and eternal, and as the minutes passed, I felt at peace. When he finished, there was a silence that descended upon us, a silence that was profound beyond words. Settle over me a quiet certainty that I was exactly where I was meant to be. Eventually, he looked up, his gaze meeting mine, and there was a softness in his expression, a warmth that filled the room, casting a glow over everything around us. He squeezed my hand, a silent promise that needed no words, and in that moment I knew that whatever lay ahead, we would face it together. There was no need for grand gestures, no need for declarations or promises. Everything we felt, everything we wanted to say, was there in the silence, in the warmth that wrapped around us, binding us together in a way that went beyond logic, beyond explanation. As the night wore on, we stayed there wrapped in each other's presence, our breaths mingling in the quiet, our hearts beating in unison. And as the first light of dawn crept into the room, casting a soft glow over us, I felt a sense of hope bloom within me, a quiet joy that I knew would stay with me long after the moment had passed. Eventually he stood, pulling me to my feet, his hand lingering in mine as we shared a quiet smile, a look that held more than words could ever express. It was a silent moment of comprehension, a relationship that beyond words, a connection that filled the air with a warmth that I knew would sustain us through whatever lied ahead. And as we stood there, the dawn light softly illuminated us. A calm assurance descended upon me, an emotion that was beyond reason and description. I knew I had discovered something unique as we hugged each other. It was a link that had been formed in solitude during our quiet moments together. With our hands still clasped together, we went out of the kitchen into the new day, and I felt a calm happiness settle over me, something I hadn't realized I was missing, something I would treasure for the rest of my life. As I turned to face him, I knew that we would overcome any obstacles that lay ahead, because it was an emotion that was beyond description and a connection that filled the voids in my heart. I knew that this was just the beginning of something beautiful, a journey that would bind us together in ways we hadn't yet discovered, but that's a story for another time. For now, we had each other, and that was enough. It was a story that hadn't ended, a story that would take us forward one day at a time.